Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you all here at the MIT Alumni Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network monthly meeting, our midsummer meeting this time round. We do these as fairly often. We also sponsor events and programs that different groups around the MIT alumni community have put on. And today we're honored to be doing supply chain sustainable framework discussion, and also just how supply chains work. It's not my thing, so I know about them, and that's about it. But anyway, this is a Zoom meeting, so the chat will be open. We are going to record it, and it will be available after the Alumni Association has a chance to process the captions. And we will be posting. We have a couple of slides today. Mostly we're working from a half an hour on the paper that was written about how to use digital tools for making supply chains sustainable and better and simpler. It's not an overriding thing, but it is a way that a group, including the folks who are speaking today, is working to make supply chain better and allow it to do more sustainability issues. So I wanted to introduce Sunita Ray, who is let me just take this down a moment. Oops. So this is the EESN monthly meeting, MIT alumni, for the middle of the summer. And I wanted to introduce our speakers for today. Before I do that, I will repeat that we are going to be posting slides after, and there aren't many of them today. And we will also be posting a recording as soon as it's ready and processed. So it's delightful that so many folks have come out in the middle of the day. And Sunita is an experienced supply chain person who's worked inside companies, outside companies as a consultant. She's based in New York now, and most of the introduction about how supply chains work and what makes them sustainable. She's focused on that a lot. And our other speaker, Peter, also has, but Sunita and Peter will speak for themselves. So thank you. Sunita, it's up to you.
Hi, let me unmute myself. Thank you so much, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And Sarah, EESN, thanks for having us here today. So we're very excited I'm very excited to be here with my colleagues, Peter Clement and Izzet. Brief introduction about me, as Sarah already mentioned, I'm a supply chain and logistics and a digital transformation executive based in New York City. I'm in Brooklyn for some of you who have visited me here. And prior to this, I've been consulting, worked with companies like Shopify, Shark Ninja, Flow Beverages, and Benjamin Moore in various supply chain and digital and technology roles. Prior to that, I've been in consulting for 20 years with my alma mater, Capgemini. I also am a certified, when I'm not working, I'm usually diving off the coast. I'm a volunteer for ocean and reef conservation, and I'm a rescue certified scuba diver. I usually go with my son, who's happy to accompany me because he gets free trips to dive sites around the world. So that's a brief about me.
And I'm going to quickly interrupt you again. I hope my screen is being shared. I did want to make the point that a very important underlying concept behind what we are trying to do with energy, environment, and sustainability is to work with the way the world is thinking about what sustainability is and what sustainable development is. The UN provides the basic concepts and overall feeling for the world. I have this little pen here on my lapel. When I meet with people and people from anywhere else in the world, they know exactly what this is. It is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, excuse me. Another concept, though, for business is for people, planet, and profit. And they overlap a lot. And when people around the world, and even in the United States, if they're providing their information, to other parts of the world, they they talk about the sustainability development goals, and they select which ones they believe their project is contributing to most. You go to the UN website, you can see which projects have reported that they're trying to make progress on the sustainable development goals. And while there are 17 of them, many of them overlap in how they help people, planet, and profit. And when you look at them, you can see that even industry, innovation, and infrastructure, that does affect people. We need people trained. We need to educate people to be able to help with our innovation and the way we build infrastructure and stuff. So there are many overlapping things here. At the center of what we often look at for sustainability is clean water and sanitation, or too much water and too little water, affordable and clean energy, and sustainable cities. They may have more environment than we expected, as well as just climate action solutions. And many of them are opportunities for the private sector or for individuals who are doing nonprofit solutions, which means that climate action really fits in all three of these things. Thank you. All right, Sunita.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a really good description of the US SDGs and very timely. Thanks for that. And of course, before my introduction of our main speaker today, Peter Clement, just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction about what we are speaking today about and a little bit about the white paper. So as we all know, sustainability is a hot topic, hot button. There are 196 countries in the world who are today in a Paris Agreement, which is a landmark regulatory accomplishment to pursue, net zero targets. As we know, the climate change and climate action is very necessary for all countries to reverse the effects of climate change. And this is kind of where the white paper comes in. As you know, European Union has been in the forefront of climate action for the past decade with government legislature and accountability. And accountability is important, and reporting of carbon emissions is important, because if we don't know what we are measuring, there is no way for us to make that change and the transformation. So a little bit about Peter Clement, and he will introduce himself shortly, but a little bit about the white paper that was an attachment to the webinar today. And if you haven't read it, a quick synopsis of the paper. The paper notes that supply chain is responsible for more than 50% of global emissions, which is actually a conservative number. It's more like 80 to 90% for a typical manufacturing, automotive, airline, and consumer goods supply chains. So the supply chain sustainability framework, which the white paper talks about, it's a strategic blueprint that treats sustainability and resilience as integrated goals rather than a trade-off. Because typically a sustainability and resilience, which essentially builds in redundancy in supply chain, is actually a conflicting goal. So this paper talks about how can we marry these two goals to arrive at a win-win situation. So the framework operates on three dimensions: the solution layers, which ranges from business value to data to processes; the solution life cycle, which is discovery through operations; and the solution reach and implementation approaches, from individual companies to global impact through ecosystems. So the white paper also propounds a crowdsourced approach and an approach on ecosystem collaboration rather than isolated company efforts, and also argues for excubation or innovation as a standalone priority task for companies, and transformative rather than incremental change. And organizations using these frameworks don't just reduce emissions, they also build competitive advantage through data sharing, ecosystems, developing new revenue streams through sustainability data, and creating resilient supply chains that are also profitable, help the planet, and develop our people's mindset change. Following this white paper, Katina X has become a global revolutionary ecosystem for the automotive industry and is now exchanging carbon footprint data across the entire automotive industry around the world. So we will talk a little bit about what inspired the white paper, what the white paper talks about, and the real world success story that's emerged from all of this today in Germany, Katina X. Without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, Peter Clement, he was also a Sloan MIT alum. Peter, on to you.
Okay, thank you, Sunita. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks you guys for showing up today and giving us your time. A brief introduction, maybe not professional, because you can read this on the event registration page, but more a little bit personal. As you can hear in my accent, I was born and raised in Germany. Actually, my first after school, I became a professionally trained banker. Yeah, but then during working in the bank, I discovered computers and I realized how they will shift the banking industry. So I studied instead of economics, computer science. Yeah, and I was a kind of black sheep for the guys at the bank who wanted me to groom me as a new economist or whatever they had in mind for me. I started in after computer science software development for a couple of years, went into IT infrastructure, then into consulting. Had then also not only teams from a project management, but I actually built businesses, for example, e-commerce business for Lufthansa Systems. But I didn't feel qualified to build a business or lead teams because I had not formal educations. And, Germans are very specific around having a formal education for everything they want to do. Yeah. So I was always thinking about an MBA. Yeah. But once you start working for 10 or 15 years, it's always difficult to get back to school for different reasons, and because I had then two small kids and I did not want to do it on top of all the work commitments. So I decided to take a sabbatical essentially after 15 years working, and went to MIT Sloan. By the way, the final shootout from a university perspective was between MIT and Stanford, yeah, people who both have Sloan Fellows programs, so I could choose either one. And I went to MIT primarily because I thought the MIT is a much more diverse place than Stanford. And I experienced both. I was there, yeah. So because my wife is Brazilian, we went after MIT to Brazil for a couple of years so that the family gets also a little bit of a Brazilian experience. I was working there for SAP, and then we headed off to Australia, where we spent 9 years, have now also the Australian citizenship, and came back 2020 in the middle of Corona to Germany, so that I landed in Munich again. It was the first day of lockdown in Germany. Yeah. So starting in Australia, I was very much working not so much in services industry, with banking and telcos, but many asset intensive industry, mining, energy utilities, manufacturing, where I discovered this whole notion of industry 4.0. So when I came back to Germany, I actually signed up for an industry association called Platform Industry 4.0 and became part there of a group which looks into digital business models, yeah, but also into sustainability topics. And then I also joined the MIT Club of Germany to start the initiatives around sustainability. And 18 months down the road, I thought, oh, here's sustainability, here's the digital side in supply chain. Somehow they go together, yeah. And therefore, since 2021, I spent my time always in this kind of on the crossroads between sustainability and Industry 4.0 or global supply chain. And with that, I give it back to Sunita because I think she has a couple of questions for me.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great introduction. And by the way, I did the exact same thing. I took a sabbatical after 20 years in the industry
There you
and
go.
came back to MIT to do my master's in supply chain. Good stuff. So, without further ado, your white paper has been, kind of a clairvoyant in the world of sustainability. Today, your Katina X is an industry, leading ecosystem, uh, enabling peer-to-peer regional and global data for specifically for the automotive industry, not just in sustainability, but overall, the entire end-to-end supply chain from, planning all the way to distribution and the last mile. So tell us, Peter, so what inspired, this white paper, and how did your white paper influence Katina X? And can you give us a quick bird's eye view on how your thought process developed?
Yeah, sure. I think it was a Sunday afternoon. I was standing under the shower, thinking about it. No, no, I'm just joking, guys. Yeah. So actually, I was not inspired. Yeah. Actually, someone asked me. Yeah, that's the whole truth be told. In this working group in Industry Platform Industry 4.0, yeah, some of the guys there who have been a long time said, why do you write a white paper on sustainable supply chain in data spaces? Yeah, without me having only a rough idea what a data space actually is, because back then it was not in the press like it is today, at least in Europe. Um, it was a little bit of a research project. It had a very short timeline. So I said, I cannot do this together with my job. I need some co-authors. Yeah. So I recruited 6 other people and we co-authored. Yeah. So we created a framework together, and every of the co-author has a separate chapter, and you probably see it from a writing style perspective a little bit in the white paper, and then we brought it all um, together. Yeah. And that was while at the same time Katina X was still in a project phase, in a research space, and these projects in the Industry 4.0 space that are sponsored mainly by the German government and the industry, and are usually 3 years research projects, they are not very public until they are done. Yeah. So it's very hard to learn something, what's going on in these kind of projects if you're not insider. Yeah. Catena X is now out of in the public because the research project is finished, and it's now run as a kind of NGO. Yeah. Um, but so it was more parallel development. So I was aware of Catena X. There's also a little bit of an interesting anecdote, if I may share the anecdote, because
Please.
I cannot remember when it was, maybe in 22 or 23. I was that there was the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium. And what they did, they brought the big supply chain players in the US together. So the Pepsis, the Apple, the Dow, the Boeings, and so on and so forth. And they collected a lot of money and hired PhD students from MIT. And they had different topics around sustainability. They collected topic, they prioritized, and I was part of this prioritization exercise with them. Yeah. And then they had one work stream around data exchange. Yeah. And I thought, oh, but that data exchange, that sounds to me like Catena X. So I back then and still talked to the top guy at Catena X and said, hey, there's maybe an opportunity there, yeah. And then I talked to the top guy, Francesco from Gaia X, which is the technical foundation of Catena X, and I brought these together with the MIT faculty to discuss if the things that Catena X was working but could not be used by the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium. But Catena X said back then, oh, we have better things to do than deal with the MIT guys, yeah. And so it never happened. Yeah, so it's a little of an anecdote, and here we are again. Yeah, so
That's very interesting. The road not taken, right?
yeah,
By Robert
exactly. Yeah.
Frost. That's the poem I remember, Peter. Very, very
Mm.
interesting background. So tell us, I learned recently after reading your white paper a year ago that you actually published it before Katina X even was launched. So tell us about Katina X today. And does it track all 3 scopes? Who are the stakeholders? And how does the consortium function today? And how many partners? Just a little bit about Katina X.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we still have 6 hours to go, I think. Yeah. Okay, good. So, so
In two
yeah, so I
minutes.
think in 2 minutes, yeah, I remember. Otherwise, Sarah's appears. Sorry, Sarah. So I think Catena X is an a big experiment. Yeah. So I mean, I'm in the industry for a little bit of time, yeah, and it's a very unique experiment, I call it. Yeah. And I think the call is still out if the experiment is successful. You know, it's like a startup. Startups also get funded and they start off, and then sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't succeed. Yeah. I think Catena X is about standards. Okay, standards on different levels from a business perspective, from a technical perspective. And I think they did a great job and spent 2 billion euros in 3 years to make this happen. Now, when you talk about data exchange platforms in the industry and supply chain or standards, that's usually driven by standard organizations like ISO or by software vendors like SAP with their business network, which used to be their Ariba software. Yeah. That's the first standardization effort I'm aware of, where actually the industry players, the technology users get together and define the standard. So the BMW, the Volkswagen, the Ford, the Bosches, the Schaeffler, the BASF, you name it. Yes, there is also one or other technology player was involved as well, but mainly the industry. And that's make it very different because the standards are not defined by the people who love to write standards, yeah, or publish, or by people who want to sell software, yeah, or hardware, but actually by people who use the technology. And you have to think about it. It's for me a very critical piece to consider. The automotive in the German government, even from a financial perspective, the German government's with 500 million, the industry 1.5 billion euros in 3 years to make this happen. So you want to have an ROI. You don't do this as a pet project or an open source project. I don't think so. And so that's a little bit of a different quality. And Catena X is very much focused on specific use cases. Sunita, you mentioned already the exchange of product carbon footprint data. And they had an
Right.
initial set of use cases developed. And what's next? There are always new use cases coming up. And how this works, essentially, from a working perspective, some of the big players, a guy from Mercedes talks to a guy from BMW and to Bosch and say, okay, so what's next in our supply chain? Where can we create additional standard? Where do we have additional use cases? For
Right.
example, at the moment, there is a new group set up for due diligence check in the supply chain. And that's how Catena X evolves. Yeah.
Fantastic. And not just standards, it's also managed to create one of the most difficult things in the industry to create, which is trust, right? It's about trust, collaboration, data sovereignty. I think a lot of, digital transformation, collaboration fails when, competitors have to share information and collaborate. And I think this has, sort of achieved that objective. Great answer. Peter, and coming to the objective of your paper, you said very interestingly, and by the way, I really enjoyed reading it. I've read it probably about 10 times now. You say that resilience is not separate from sustainability, right? It's part of it. Now, given that, resilience and sustainability, and I have to, I will not do this justice if I do not quote my professor, Yossi Sheffi, who's also the dean of the supply chain department, and I'm probably a club carrying member of his fan club. And I always stop by to say hello to him whenever I'm in E40 building. Who's, by the way, the number one supply chain influencer in the world consistently for several years now. He very famously said that companies will not spend on sustainability unless they know that it's going to be an ROI for them, right? Patagonia is a great example of spending on sustainability, but they're able to command that premium for their brand because they are known as a good actor. And you also mentioned that in your paper about how customers perceive good actors, good corporate behavior, and they will reward them accordingly. So my question here is, how has Catena X circumvented those challenges as an ecosystem?
So I think, of course, even now, forget about sustainability. There are always conflicting goals in organizations. There are always trade-offs, often trade-offs that you need to make. Cost versus safety. Yeah, forget the environment. Cost versus safety in a plant, for example. So at the end of the day, I think there's always conflicts between different things. And one task of management is to make the right call in a specific situation, maybe set priority through policies or values or whatever. And that's just normal. Yeah, that was before sustainability and will be after sustainability. The only thing that I want to call out is because the term sustainability and resilience is not standardized. Yeah, you always need to ask the people. So when you talk about sustainability or about resilience, what do you actually mean? Yeah, and that's
Absolutely.
important for me. We talked about the UN sustainability goals. Yeah, and in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there is also something about the economy and growth and infrastructure. Okay, and there's something about the environment there as well. Yeah, so I think that. But I think when the word sustainability was used, the focus and is still on the environmental piece of sustainability. And that sits in our minds. Yeah. And then we take this into the discussions. Um, but actually, if you look at the triple bottom line, the three Ps or other concepts, or even the ESG concept in environment, social, and governments, many of these concepts, or if you look, for example, in the sustainability reporting of the European Union, CSRD, you also see again the social aspect, the environmental aspect, the governance, the business aspect in there. And so I think in the end of the day, there are always conflicts, and the organizations set their priorities and make decisions accordingly.
Absolutely. And I also like the fact that, you mentioned in your paper that data-driven solutions can actually show you where the weak points in your supply chain lies. And by eliminating those costs, you're also, eliminating carbon emissions. Some very interesting, I can think of some very interesting examples, but in order to keep our time, I'm just going to move on to our next question. And I love the fact, Peter, that you described data as sunshine. For the past couple years, ever since AI's popularity or democratization, I won't say ever since AI came in, AI has existed for nearly 40 years. But I think it became a household word because of Gen AI. And data was always called the new oil or the black gold. But you describe data as sunshine, which I absolutely love and I agree. It's abundant, it's everywhere, but it needs to be harvested and shared. So I like that whole description of the data. And given, of course, the competitive nature of supply chains, what kind of incentivizations or incentive structures can be most effective in encouraging data sharing, especially among companies not only are delivering similar homogeneous services and products, but companies which are even competing with each other? How do you enable the most effective data sharing?
Uh, I think there's always the technical piece, yeah, and that's done, for example, by Catena X and other X initiatives, for example, Aerospace X. But at the end of the day, it's up to the supply chain partners to decide which data they want to share. Yeah. It's not that you participate in these schemes or these data spaces and then all your data flows out in the public space. No, I mean, you define who has access to what data in which form, reading or writing, period. So there still has to be a kind of negotiation between the different supply chain partners about what data is exchanged, how long is it valid, and also if there is a cost attached or not. Yeah. I think at the moment, I think the smart thing that Catena X did, they started with data exchange with data that is so far not exchanged digitally. Product carbon footprint. You exchange orders and whatever in invoices, yeah, but you usually don't exchange carbon footprint data in electronic form. So that was the focus, and I think that made it easier for the competitors to agree to exchange data, because they don't see the direct how this influences their profit margin. Yeah, but let's be honest. Yeah, in a traditional supply chain, you have the big guys sitting on the top, and they order, yeah, and they push down the prices in the past or whatever, yeah, or the lead times or what have you. But everyone in the supply chain, at least the guys in Europe, need to do the sustainability reporting. So they need data, not only their data from their operations, but also the data, yeah, scope 3 from the supply chain partners.
Right.
So they have an interest to get the correct data. Why? Because if I don't get the correct data from my supply chain partner and I report this to the EU and it comes out that the data is not correct, I have a little bit of an issue with the European Union. Yeah. And so I think it's the usual thing that the big guys on the top of the food chain try to push it down the supply chain in order to get higher quality data on things they need to do anyway.
Okay, great. And I can think of my real life example during my Walmart days when Walmart, I was sort of managing their whole supplier management and command center at Walmart. And that time, Walmart wanted to do a pilot with its largest supplier. I can't name who that is due to NDAs, but they wanted to share their point of sale information to the supplier, and the supplier wanted to share their inventory forecasting and demand forecast with Walmart. And initially, there was a lot of concerns on data sharing. And when we introduced data sovereignty and data masking, it actually proved to be a most trusting partnership. And both companies, Walmart as well as the supplier, one of the largest top 10 companies in the world, even benefited due to this data sharing. So what you describe is spot on, and I think as more trust and sovereignty come into play, there's going to be a lot more supplier collaboration, and it's going to be better for the world in general and for our planet. And coming to the most important, I think a top of mind question for most people when they look at ecosystems like this and initiatives and data transformation, this is not just data transfer, it's supply chain transformation in a sense. What kind of metrics and measurements do you think we can effectively measure and communicate the business impact of these measurements to stakeholders, right? And how do you tackle stakeholders who are focused on, say, single-handedly profitability or revenues or margins, and when they hear, oh, we have to spend more on these projects, what do you say to them, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, again, looking back at Catena X, I mean, the whole exchange of product carbon footprint data was triggered by upcoming compliance and regulation. Yeah, so organizations are forced to do something. Yeah, so that's a big motivator. Yeah, interesting is right now as the legislation and the constraints in Europe are taken down a little bit. Yeah, with some regulations. And I think the question is always, what's the value? And traditionally in the supply chain, like in many businesses, it's all about the balance sheet and the cost and the revenue. We have heard about customer satisfaction, I think. Yeah. So I think, but how do you measure? I mean, you can have an NPS score but how do you see the impact of an NPS score on your balance sheet? Yeah, you can only say qualitative. I think if I have a high customer satisfaction, I make more revenue. Yeah, but it's really hard to measure. So I think organizations and individuals really should think beyond the traditionally financial accounting, because there's carbon accounting now coming up. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of additional benefits that you can measure only qualitatively that come from investment in sustainability initiatives.
I love that. I love that customer experience and customer service levels is an important benefit as well. It's usually hard to measure, but if you look at the tenets of supply chain design, typically for network optimization, we go with both costs and time and customer satisfaction. Wouldn't it be nice to also have sustainability as one of the parameters? Just a
Yeah,
question to think about in the future. So
yeah,
great answer.
yeah.
Moving on, you pointed out the people dimension, emphasizing a leadership mindset change. Like this goes off what you just talked about, when people are worried mostly about balance sheets and P&Ls and profit margins, and only because they really can't measure what the sustainability initiatives, drives for them. So, what specific, leadership behaviors have you observed, and what would be most effective to drive sustainability adoption for organizations, especially ones with complex supply chains?
Yeah, I think there is one guy, I think his name is Peter Truck or something like that, yeah, who said you cannot manage what you can't measure. Yeah. And
Right.
and there you go. And I think the same, if you cannot measure sustainability, you cannot manage it. You don't get a transformation going. It's very easy. Yeah. I mean, we heard a lot about CO2 emissions for the last couple of years, and we will continue to hear it about the next 1,000 years probably. Yeah. But there's a lot of other things. If you think, for example, about fair trade coffee, yeah, there it's about fair wages in the supply chain. Yeah, so there are initiatives out there that look at other aspects than just the direct financial outcome. And my experience with big organizations is there are many people very passionate about the environment and sustainability, but there's nothing they can do. Why? Because how the organization is measured. If you don't change the KPIs, you will not get a change in behavior. It's very simple. Yeah. So if I'm only measured by P&L and not by customer satisfaction, we all know what will happen. Yeah, I cost optimize to death until my customer satisfaction goes away and I shut down my business. Yeah. So I think the KPIs, how can we measure additional aspects that contribute either to the top or to the bottom line, even if it's qualitative? Yeah. That's, I think, the only thing. But in order to make this shift, obviously the leadership needs to shift in their mindset as well. Yeah, I think that's how it all starts.
Train the trainer approach. So train the leaders, and you have everyone following suit. Brilliant.
You need a high level champion for things.
Yes.
Um, there are a couple of comments now in the chat, and this is great because this is a new format for us. We wanted to focus on a project and something that alums are doing first. And we now want to open up to more of a general discussion among all of you folks. So one question is Katina X intended to be a data repository? This is from Jasmine Jinjua Sinkular, and I may be saying that wrong, but I hope not. Is Katina X intended to be a data repository across global suppliers to enable a consistent and objective source of GHG emissions data for scope 3 emissions generally by industry sector, specific by supplier, along with targets toward net zero, as reported in credible standards and tracked for authenticity by an unbiased independent assurer? All right, my two panelists, it's longer than I expected, but there you go. Have at it.
Yeah. No, I think the answer is very simple. No. That's the shortened version. No. Yeah. And why? And that's, I think I touched a little bit on it before. Most of the data exchange platform solutions or whatever store the data on a central technical platform where everyone has access to. The issue, and that's done by startups, it's done by SAP and others. The problem is you need to transfer your whole data to the system of another party, which means you're not longer in control of your data. And Catena X is completely different because the data stays within in your company. You don't put the data on a central platform. The central platform just connects the partners for data exchange, okay? And then the parties exchange the data directly using the standards that are identified or defined by Catena-X.
Brilliant. I think the biggest data repository really is CDP, right? It's Carbon Disclosure Project, which is more of a government regulatory, compliance organization. So this is more of a data exchange between partners on API.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, Sunita. I mean, but in the supply chain, you don't all the compliance reporting stuff, CDP, CSRD, they report on a company level.
Yeah.
But that does not help you in a supply chain because you need the data on a product level, and that's very different. Yeah, you can aggregate the product data to the company data, but you cannot take the company data and break it down by product that you received. Yeah, that's not direct data. You really need to get the data per product and then add it up across the supply chain and make sure that you stay in control of your own data.
And I think that's probably what's contributed to Catena-X's success is it's actually useful data that can, transform your supply chain, and you can use it to, to as levers to redesign your supply chain if need be, versus just compliance disclosures.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
by the way, I also have another question from the audience. Rita asked Rita and Sony that they're particularly interested in the social aspect of the supply chain, so especially among B2Bs. Since one of the major reasons for outsourcing is cost savings, how do cost-inducing sustainability principles such as living wages get incentivized?
Yeah, I mean, I take a step. I think it's all down to how you measure value in the supply chain, right? And if my customers want to make sure that there is no human rights violation or child labor in the supply chain, for example, from a branding perspective or whatever perspective, then they need to know. They need to know what happens, also from a social perspective. There's no other way. Now you can say, how do I get this data? So are the factories in Asia actually prepared to give the data? But again, I go back to fair trade. Yeah, I don't know if you guys know how fair trade works, but fair trade, they have auditors that go to the coffee plantations. Yeah, and what they see, they put into a system, into a technical system, and then they get a certification if there is fair pay. So it's via audits. And if you look in the supply chain, there are many initiatives already out there around audits of factories from different perspective. Yeah, there's Strive in the automotive industry, and there's RBA and others. Yeah, so there are these audits that, I mean, at the end of the day, how you create trust, Sunita. You talked about trust in the supply chain. If I cannot trust my suppliers, I need to have a way to audit them by a third party, to make sure that the data that they give me is actually correct.
I want to quickly say that in Massachusetts, we've been trying to get some new transit subway cars, and we ordered them from China, however long ago it takes to build a subway car. But it's being held up right now in the Port of Philadelphia because there's a question from our administration about whether China is actually using Uyghur labor or not. So anyway, that's enough for me. But Izet, I think you wanted to call on the next person, and I completely forgot that we actually can ask our own questions.
But Rita, really great question, and I know that labor arbitrage is real today, right? I mean, how do you go about solving the problem? I think the world has to just become smaller than it already is. So I'll end with that.
Thank you. And by the way, as Sarah said in the beginning of the meeting, this is a free meeting. So feel free to also unmute if you want to ask your questions directly. It might be even better to capture the essence as opposed to reading. And if it is okay for you, Shishi Chen, I'd like to call out your name. You asked about Bitcoin, but you please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you all. Thank you, Peter, for the great conversation. Several years ago, I was working with big brands on supply chain sustainability issues, including Walmart. I was reviewing Walmart 1Geek10 data as a third-party NGO partner trying to avoid double counting in their data. So I was very curious about blockchain because several years ago, probably 7 to 8 years ago, there was a blockchain fever everywhere. Everyone was talking about it, including those global brands on supply chain issues. I recall Walmart even set up an innovation lab at that time, set up pilots using blockchain technologies to solve some sustainability issues, for example, food security, also like the labor issue we just mentioned, people just mentioned could be solved by blockchain. However, I walked away from this area a few years ago, but I stopped hearing about people talking about using blockchain technology to solve sustainability or supply chain issues. So I'm curious if this is still promising in this field to leverage blockchain, or this is totally not feasible at all nowadays.
That's a brilliant question, Gigi. I too, like you, had walked away from it. I was part of the blockchain roundtable at MIT. The technology is actually pretty remarkable, right? I mean, it's immutable, it's authentic, there's just no way for you to change the data. But upon further research, one of the conclusions that I came to was unless every party in the supply chain, for instance, for traceability and trackability across end-to-end supply chain, unless everyone is part of the network and every node has the technology and the software sophistication needed, it's not feasible yet to leverage blockchain across supply chain. So that still is the case. I would be surprised if we can actually go end to end, but there are places where you can use blockchain in certain parts or subsets of supply chain, maybe just in procurement, just upstream, or maybe just downstream. But end to end, it's still very, very hard. But it is a great technology.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
That's great. Go ahead, you
Sorry,
said.
Sarah, go on.
Was there another one you saw?
Sakib mentioned, it's not a question, but he mentioned about idea generation. I wanted to ask if he wanted to elaborate on this.
Sakib, would you care to talk a little bit about logistics companies being part of having to digitalize their information?
Basically, my company is. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. So my company is basically operating in a B2B segment, and over here we are basically relying more precisely towards the downstream, and where we are engaging with the logistic company to move our products, which is being manufactured by someone, and then it revolve around the different regions of my company where we operate. So the whole thing which we were talking about sustainability and emission, the thing I come across with freight forwarding company, they are unable to provide us any emission. So we just estimate on that. There are certain kind of initiatives that we took about because we are not a manufacturer. So there are certain initiatives we took about, okay, no plastic in our office, reuse your own mug, your glasses. So these kind of things we can initiate. But as far as my supply chain is concerned, I am concerned that how much emission the overall my supply chain is basically incurring through that logistics movement. So this is an area which we cannot figure out unless we have a emission data from the freight forwarding company. So that is one of the suggestions. That's the same thing I have mentioned over there over the chat box. that if something can be do on a global level, because the shaving companies across the globe are so many.
Good point.
You're talking about scope 3, you're essentially, right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
and I think that is Peter can talk till cows come home on the topic. That's exactly what the framework talks about as well. And it's about every tier end supplier. So as a supplier of, paint, my pigment supplier and my resin supplier have their own suppliers. As long as all of these tier suppliers become primary suppliers in an ecosystem like Katina X, this is absolutely possible. Peter, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I would say from a perspective of the individual company, there is no scope 2 or 3. Yeah, there's only scope 1, and scope 1 adds up. Yeah, scope 3 will only there's if I have a scope 1 and I put this into my products, yeah, and then I give the data to my customer, it becomes their scope 3. And the same is with logistics. Yeah. So there's actually no scope 2, 3, 1 emission. That's just a thinking model. Yeah. In the end of the day, it's important that every company in the supply chain tracks their own sustainability matrix and then passes it on upstream or downstream or whatever they needed in the supply chain. So that, and also in Catena X briefly, there's the concept of primary and secondary data, because it's so hard to get actually data, for example, around CO2 in the supply chain, also from a logistics perspective. So there are a lot of databases out there where if you have certain data, you can calculate the CO2 footprint of your freight forwarder, for example, but only if you know what kind of truck he used and how many kilometers or miles he got or everything. So at the end of the day, I think the Catena X provides a technical foundation to also plug in the logistics provider. Okay, period. Yeah, the technical foundation is there, but there are not a lot of logistics provider currently involved. Yeah, so what usually happens if Bosch ships a braking system to BMW and Bosch uses DB Schenker as a logistics provider, then this part then is, for example, becomes part of the braking system. Yeah. So the product carbon footprint of the braking system that Bosch ships to BMW. Yeah. So there is a whole, just to give you a little, and it's a very complicated thing from a calculation perspective. And that's also why in Catena X, there is what they call the product carbon footprint rule book, which describes not only how to measure carbon emissions in the supply chain, but also how to calculate it. Yeah, because if every supplier would calculate their carbon footprint in a different way, and you would add it up, then at the OEM level, at BMW, who reports to the EU their carbon data, that it's like bananas and oranges, right? What did I say last time we talked to Nita? It's a nice fruit salad, yeah, and bananas and
Fruit
everything.
salad, yes.
But I want to have a banana salad, not a fruit salad, yeah. But I report a fruit salad without maybe even knowing it. I suspecting it, but I don't know, yeah. And anyway, long story short, the technical foundation is there for the automotive industry. The logistics provider can just plug in and then submit their carbon data along. Yeah. And then you say, oh, it's not a product, it's a service. That's correct. Yeah. As a supplier, you have a service, not a product. But then you can just handle one. If I ship a braking system from Bosch to BMW, yeah, that's essentially then my product, so to speak. Yeah, and I can price this. I price this, and if I price it, I can also find out what the carbon footprint is because I know my fleet and where it's traveling. So together with the invoice to Bosch or whoever pays it, I can give them also the product carbon footprint. Yeah, not an issue. For example, yeah, period. Yeah, in many things in Europe already now, if you order some things and it has carbon included, they call out the carbon in cost because there's a carbon tax on many things nowadays. Yeah, so you can do it. So
We
the
have
things
about
are there, you just need to use it.
Good. We have about 2 minutes left. Elizabeth?
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Hi. Thanks, Anita and Peter, for the talk. I was wondering about those really conservative sectors like in defense or places that have dual use products. How might you convince them to think about this model? Because I guess from my experience, they tend to deviate more towards this initial view you mentioned, where they see resilience and sustainability as two opposing forces and tend to use the reasons, perhaps very reasonably, of things like export control and reasons like that as to be very conservative with their data sharing. Nevertheless, if we all want to be more responsible in society, then this may be something they could also think about, even if it's not their priority. Is there a way of adapting the framework that would let those types of companies participate as well?
I mean, from a technical perspective, they can always participate. The question is about the motivation. Why should I do this? Yeah. But even if I'm a defense contractor, if I'm Airbus, for example, is that delivering some Euro drones, yeah, in Europe, or if I Lockheed Martin or whoever, who is my buyer? Who is my buyer? It's the government. Who signs up for the Paris Climate Agreement? Governments.
Most
Okay.
governments.
So if governments put sustainability metrics in their procurement, there you have it.
So ultimately, the government has to be the catalyst.
Well, this has really been fun, and we have had some very good success trying to make this a little more open in discussion. Our next webinar, though, will be a webinar where it'll only be questions and answers, and even those you'll have to sign up for ahead of time. Energy, environment, and sustainability is coordinating with the MIT Club of Northern California for alums to introduce our alumni community to the new MIT VP for Energy and Climate. Professor Evelyn Wang of the Mechanical Engineering Department came on at the beginning of April, and we are going to be speaking with her at 5:30 Pacific time, which is going to be awfully late for you guys in Europe, but that's what we arranged, and she'll be talking about where she comes from, her work at ARPA-E, and how she came to MIT, what she sees for the new role she's in. For one thing, she is in charge of MIT's new climate project, which is a kind of a management thing that helps to pull together a lot of the research and have researchers talking to each other. So that's going to be September 18th. And we do welcome alums, especially because we just want to make sure that MIT remembers we're out here doing this same kind of work that they're busy doing research for. I shouldn't have said it quite that way, but that's okay. And everything that EESN does is open to the public, virtually everything. And our website is at eesn.alumnicommunity.mit.edu. So you'll find there events that are coming up. You'll find information about our different groups, and our groups are welcome to talk with the public and include public members in their own way. For the network, we're the umbrella organization, and we try to promote and feature alums. So this was really excellent, Sunitha and Izet and Peter, that you're eager to do this. I will add, because we're right at 2 o'clock, there's 5 new chats here. I hope they're mostly just thanks. There we go. Amy put our website in. That's our long version, but that's okay. It works. This has been really helpful, this new format. I hope everybody kind of found it a little better than just a webinar with questions and answers. Peter and Sunitha and Izet are also working on I don't know quite if it's going to be focused on digital supply chain and sustainable supply chain, but we have not had a cross-interest group of software and digital people. So there's going to be a sustainable digital group among alumni. And as soon as there are five people who want to do that kind of a subject, Peter and Sunitha are definitely on board for that. I believe Izet is also, because an awful lot of the climate and sustainability work has been done in a garage on your computer laptop. I'm a civil engineer. I like to talk about the hard tech, and I know how hard it is to get that there. We are hoping to put on a webinar in October about the fusion breakthroughs and the fusion commercialization that is about to happen. It's going on in Europe and it's going on in the United States. And it's possible that when we talk nuclear in the future, we'll be talking about fusion without waste products and that kind of stuff. So I thank you all for coming. And we're at our close for today. And keep an eye on our website if you want to see what our different events are, and let your friends know that we're there. There's also a library of resources. Bye now.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Sarah.
Yes.
Thank you.